I speak to about the story of Comedy Central and how a maverick gets things done despite opposition. Art talks about what it's like to start a business within a business, how he went from working as a finance analyst at HBO and conceiving the idea of Comedy Central. This podcast is about the story of his journey and the parallels to succeeding in business. He also talks about how he noticed the power of the comedian and pondered how this can be used. Listen up to the rest of the conversation. Before we begin our conversation, here is a quick shout out to the pathologically curious. Check out the Maverick Paradox magazine. It's a digital magazine written by Mavericks for business owners and professionals. You can find the magazine at themaverickparadox.com. The magazine's aim is to provoke maverick leadership everywhere. Welcome to the Maverick Paradox podcast, where we explore what it is to be a maverick and discover effective modes of leadership. I am Judith Germain, and my mission is to propel the maverick mindset into a world where character and integrity will ultimately have a higher premium than personality and bureaucracy. So thank you for joining me on this journey. If you would like to continue with me, then please subscribe to my podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or one of the other popular podcast platforms. And today, our guest is Art Bell. Hi, Art.
Hi, Judith. How are you?
I'm really good. What about you?
I'm good. Thank you.
I'm very excited to talk to you today, Art. But before I tell the listeners why, tell us about you.
Well, that's a pretty broad question. I spent most of my career in the media business at cable channels, and currently I am not working. I spent some time consulting, but I stopped consulting because I wanted to write. And I ended up writing a memoir about one of my biggest business adventures. And it's called Constant Comedy, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And that's what it's about. I mean, I started Comedy Central when I was at HBO. I was a financial analyst. I pitched it. It was kind of crazy. And of course they said, "What are you, crazy?" But I hung in there and I kept pushing for it. And as luck would have it, I finally got it to happen. And not only that, but I worked on it for the next 8 years. So I'm very proud of that. And I thought it would be a good idea to relate that experience in a memoir so that people could see what it's like to start a business inside another business, and also to deal with the realities of pushing for something get to become a reality when the odds are against you.
Gosh, there's so much. Where do I begin? Okay, let's start with, I've defined mavericks as willfully independent people, and you sound like you hit that definition. What do you think?
Well, I think that's right. I tried to stay in my lane a lot of the time, but I ended up doing badly at that. And I really looked for ways to, I wouldn't say disrupt, because I wasn't a disruptor as such. But I did, I did sort of speak truth to power an awful lot for a young person in a corporation. And then going forward, that was always my approach. Like, let's take this on. Let's get crazy. Let's do something, that's never been done before. And even though people often said, you can't do that, whether it was a comedy or somewhere else, I'd always say, well, let's, watch me. And so, yes, I think I do fit your definition of a maverick. Yeah.
And I think it's very mavericky what you did. So you was in finance and you just sat there one day and say, you know what would be really funny if we did a comedy show? Is that how your brain went? It's bizarre.
Well, sadly, it's a little more complicated than that. I actually been what they now call a comedy nerd since I was about 7 or 8 years old. I loved comedy. I thought it was fantastic. And I used to watch comedy on TV on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was a weekly variety show, which is the only place I could really see comedians, but I saw some of the great comedians, Richard Pryor, Alan King, on the Ed Sullivan Show. And what I was really impressed with was their power, their ability to make people laugh. And not just, people in my house or people in the audience, but millions of people all over the country and probably all over the world at that point. I thought, wow, that's something I got to get to understand, because it seems like such an important human ability. And the people who are best at seem to get a lot further than the people who don't have a sense of humor. So I really became a comedy nerd. I listened to all the comedy albums when I was growing up. I wrote some comedy and satire when I was in high school. Started a newspaper called The Tongue, which regularly got us in trouble with the school administration. But I just found it fascinating. And when I went to college, I did a little performing. I have to say, I did a little performing, not stand-up, more sketch and theater. I never really saw myself as a stand-up comic of any sort. But all my life, I just really wanted to be, to know about comedy and to be in the audience mostly, but also to write. I have to say, I liked writing comedy.
What's really fascinating, I think, about that is that at such a young age, the thing that got you hooked was being impressed with the power of the comedian, as opposed to the humour. I mean, obviously the humour was in it, but it was the power that got you first. I thought that's quite interesting.
Well, it was, I don't know which came first. Certainly I was laughing, but I was also noticing that everybody else was laughing. And I thought that's pretty powerful. And then, listen, I experienced myself to a certain extent. I mean, everyone who has any experience being funny tells a story about using humor to disarm a situation that was likely to be physically problematic, as in getting beat up on the playground, which is, every kid's job is to keep from getting beat up on the playground at school. And some kids, as in nature, actually, it just occurs to me, some like the moose has no actual predators because it's so gigantic. That's its, that's the way it avoids getting beat up. And, big kids don't have to worry about getting beat up too much, but I wasn't a big kid. I was kind of a little kid, and I was smart, on top of that, which was 2 strikes right there. So I got harassed a lot on the playground, and I found that I could defuse a situation sometimes, more often than not, by being funny. And that came in very handy. So that was a little bit of a superpower as a kid. Although it did get me in trouble in class. I'd get thrown out of class quite a bit.
But that must have made you a bit of a superhero, though, with your friends.
Yeah, listen, I'm not telling secrets by saying that being funny when you're a kid is important, because that's one of the ways people interact with you. And if you're known to be funny, then you're more likely to get invited to parties, even if you're not a football player, one of the popular kids, it's like, oh, Art's funny. Yeah. Get him at the party, because at least he'll keep things lively. So that was, that was kind of helpful. Yeah, it was about the power of it. I wasn't silly. And then I will say this, satire, very important. I was a big fan of Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. Well, one of the first things I really thought was a great piece of writing, because it was funny, and it was so offbeat, talking about being a maverick. And also its point of view was so stark, and it had a great, impact on the world by being funny. And then I thought a lot about that. I thought a lot about satire impacting the world, and how often that happened. And, again, I guess I'm making a great case more than anything else for comedy and humor as being an important part of humanity, our humanity, and also a powerful a powerful tool to harness almost everywhere. And I will throw in business with that. I worked in a corporation. If you can be funny when you're, with your colleagues, very helpful in communicating.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious now then. So what were you? You were a finance analyst or something like that?
Yeah, well, I got to HBO based on my ability to do forecasting models, if you can believe that. I wanted to be in the television business, and I had gone back to business school. But before I went back to business school, I was an economist. I was hired as an economist out of college. And I worked in Washington, D.C. at a consulting firm, and we did a lot of econometric modeling for the energy department and for some other agencies. And somebody called me up. I was working at CBS. That was my first job out of grad school, and said, I'm over at HBO. This place is a riot, home box office. It's really the future of television. And they're looking for somebody who can forecast subscribers because they seem to be mucking that up pretty regularly, their subscriber forecast. And they want to get more accurate. And you're the only guy I could think of in the industry who knows anything about econometric forecasting. So why don't you come interview for it? And I did. And I got the job. Now, let me just say, econometric forecasting was about the last thing I wanted to do in the entertainment business. But, being at HBO, which had I guess there were probably 1,000 employees then, was a lot better than being at CBS, where there were probably, and again, I don't know the number, but it seemed like 20,000 employees. I mean, it was just a giant, sprawling company. And I was at CBS, I was nowhere near programming. I was nowhere near the product. I could have been working at IBM for all you knew. If you walked into my office, it looked like, it was gray and boring, and that was it. And, listen, I did my work and I had a good time, good enough time for a first job in the entertainment business, but I knew that wasn't my last stop. So going to HBO was very important to me. And yes, I started as an analyst doing subscriber forecasts.
So how did you get then so you were sitting there and then you decided that why not do comedy? So wasn't there nothing like Comedy Central at the time? It sounds like a quite innovative product.
Well, at the time, cable channels were just starting to pop up. I mean, HBO had been around for several years by the time I got there. But for example, ESPN was pretty new, Lifetime, Arts and Entertainment Channel. These were just getting started. And some channels hadn't gotten started yet. It was towards the end of the 80s, early 90s that I was doing all this. There were probably, and again, I won't get the number right, 20, 25 cable channels. Now there's 10,000? I mean, there were not very many cable channels, partly because it was very expensive to start a channel, and partly because it was risky business. I mean, it was a new business and nobody really knew how it was going to go. Remember, the world was dominated by the three big networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. Fox showed up in the early 90s. And those three networks, they were getting most of the audience, if not all of it at the beginning, and most of the advertising revenue and most of the talent. They had money. So the idea of starting any kind of cable channel was pretty gutsy. When ESPN, this all sports channel in the U.S., which is now international, I know, started, they were covering girls lacrosse high school games in prime time for a while. They didn't have money for NFL and Major League Baseball. They were covering whatever they could cheaply. And so the idea of an all comedy network, which didn't exist, which had occurred to me years before, because I loved comedy. That wasn't very popular. And I really thought a lot about it as I got into the television business, because I said, you know what? I would love to work in an all comedy network. I mean, how much fun would that be? And how important it would be to give that to the world. I mean, I know that's kind of crazy, but that's the way I thought. And there wasn't an all comedy network. So that's how that whole thing started.
So interesting, because Mavericks, I think socialized Mavericks work for the greater good. And that's exactly what you just said there, isn't it? Give it to the world.
Oh yeah. Listen, I was so proud after the launch of the channel, after the channel became successful, especially. And people would say, "What do you do?" And I say, "Well, I work in cable television." Sometimes they'd kind of say, huh, "Really?" And I'd say, "Listen, I make millions. We make millions of people laugh. I feel great about that. Making people laugh is probably one of the greatest gifts you can give people." And I pitched the channel when I originally pitched it. I said all comedy, all the time. But then I realized that my pitch would be better if I said, "We will be the center of the comedy universe," and that's that I think that got more attention when I started talking about it that way.
Yeah, I mean that's a great Maverick trait to be able to narrate, be able to tell the story.
Yeah,
so
vision.
But in a way that people can really see it. Yeah.
Right, because you know what? These businesses, they don't start out gigantic and successful. They start out small, but it's really about the vision that you can convey about what the channel can be. That's important. And, again, I had a head start because I thought comedy was important. I thought that was very powerful. And I knew a lot about it. Not the comedy business, by the way. I knew a lot about comedy, but not the comedy business. And there's a difference. But I really thought an all comedy channel would be a force for good in the world.
So how did you do it then? So tell me that story.
Right. Okay. So here's the thing. I spent some time, as I said, forecasting subscribers for HBO. And one of my plans doing that was, if I did a really good job, then maybe people would notice me around the company. I'd get a better job. And that's what happened. HBO was trying to develop another channel, which they called Festival, which was supposed to be for pay television subscribers who wouldn't buy HBO. You have to subscribe to HBO and get it every month. People weren't subscribing to HBO. And of course, the executives were saying, "Hey, why doesn't everybody want HBO?" Well, the answer was, everybody doesn't want HBO because HBO is presenting uncut, uncensored movies and comedy and all kinds of other things. And people were either, for religious reasons, or they had children in their home or whatever. They just said, I don't need that in my home. This is stuff I have in my living room. So HBO said, okay, well, let's develop a paid television channel for people who don't like sex, violence, and bad language in their entertainment. And as soon as they hired me to do some financial analysis and some research, some market research. And I was part of that team. So I actually got to work with some programmers for the first time, which was really fun. Of course, there was a fallacy in their thinking, because two fallacies, actually. It's not that people didn't like sex, violence, and bad language in their entertainment, because that's almost silly to contemplate. It's that they didn't want it in their home. And secondly, try selling an entertainment product, or any product for that matter, by saying, here's what it doesn't have. Now, I guess people say, well, this is a low salt food or a low calorie food, or, but even Diet Coke has to say it tastes good. You know what I mean?
And they say zero as well, don't they? They don't say it doesn't have it. They say zero.
Right. So I immediately thought this thing was going to fail. And through no fault of my own, I like to think anyway, it failed pretty quickly. They never really got out of the test phase because it just, two things. One, as I just described, it wasn't working too well because we couldn't get television viewers' attentions with our pitch. And second, we got competition. The Disney Channel, which had started and was really a kids channel at that point, the Disney Channel saw what we were doing and said, hey, we could put movies on, nice, clean movies on at night. And we can pitch the parents of the kids that we're showing, all the other stuff to during the day. And that's what they did. And they basically ate our lunch, there was no market anymore. That was the end of that. So that whole thing folded, and that gave me an opportunity to concentrate on what I was going to do next. And I started thinking about the Comedy Network and what a comedy network would look like. Not that I'd been thinking about what it looked like, but I actually started doing some financial projections and putting together like what the programming would be and how it would be done cheaply enough to start and how it would evolve. And, really I wouldn't call it a business plan in the formal sense, but I was writing pages about this thing. You know what I mean? Because I had nothing else to do. My job had been, that project was done. They told me they wouldn't fire me because HBO was like that in those days. They kept you around if they liked you, and they were going to keep me around. But I was young and wanted to get to work. So I decided to write this up, and I was going to staple it to my resume and send it to all the other entertainment companies around and see if they, number one, would interview me for a job. And secondly, maybe they'd get interested in the Comedy Network, But around that time, I also thought, wait a second, I can't just keep quiet about it. I am an HBO employee. I should tell them about this. So I made an appointment with Bridget Potter, who was the chairman. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Bridget was the head of programming at HBO. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know her. She was, kind of the legend that was putting television programs on HBO that were, that were becoming hits and making HBO successful. So, she was a fairly very important person at the company. So I made an appointment with her. I said, I'm going to just walk right in there and I'm going to pitch this to her, which I did. And I said, Bridget, I really think HBO ought to do a 24/7 comedy channel, all comedy all the time. And she said, stop right there. That is the worst idea I have ever heard. And let me tell you why. And she proceeded to tell me why. She said, no decent comedian would be on an all comedy network. Robin Williams, Whoopi, they wouldn't be on it, and nobody wants that much comedy. And there's plenty of comedy on television anyway. We don't need an all comedy. She just kind of went on and on for about 7 or 8 minutes and then said, well, thanks for coming by. And that was, that was the whole thing. And I walked out. I was, as you can imagine, kind of disappointed. But I went back to my office and kept working because I thought she was wrong. I said, Bridget's wrong. There is going to be an all comedy network. May not be HBO to start it, but there will be one.
Wow. So despite the setback, you said you were going to go ahead, and then presumably you pitched it, and then they set it up. And then people must have thought you were crazy, though.
Well, listen, Bridget certainly thought I was crazy. And I did get a chance, just by chance, to pitch this to the chairman of HBO. His name was Michael Fuchs, very powerful man. He had just been named the most powerful man in Hollywood about 2 weeks before. But my boss's boss saw me working on this stuff, said, what are you working on? I told him. He said, well, I think Michael Fuchs should see this. I think the chairman should see this. I said, great, And then he said, come on, let's go. And I said, what, right now? And he said, yes. And we walked in there. He walked me into the chairman's office. I had no presentation materials. I had no idea what I was going to say, other than the kind of pitch I gave Bridget. But we walked into Michael's office. He said, what do you want? And I pitched my little heart out. And he said, okay, let's give it a try. Sounds interesting. Let's do some research. Let's do a demo tape. Let's, talk to advertisers and see if this thing's viable. And that's how it got started.
Wow. That's really good. You said earlier your memoir was talked about how you lost your humor. So how did you do that?
Well, I subtitled it, how I started Comedy Central and lost my sense of humor, because I wanted to really give people, before they got inside the book, on the outside of the book, the idea that this was a very difficult and emotionally draining and almost a failed project. I mean, the first year we launched Comedy Channel. It was called Comedy Channel when HBO first launched it. We launched the Comedy Channel, and immediately we were trashed by the press. I mean, there weren't a lot of people who could see it because there weren't a lot of subscribers yet. On day one, you don't have a lot of subscribers, but the press was merciless. They said we were the Gong Channel. They said, HBO's Michael Fuchs isn't funny. I mean, it just went, it went on and on. So it was embarrassing. It was humiliating, especially for Michael, who had, he had a reputation to protect. I didn't have much of a reputation yet. So it wasn't that problem for me. But I did feel a personal responsibility to make it successful. That said, I went to work every day trying to think about, how to make it better, and thinking that that was the day they were going to shut it down. And I did that for most of the first year.
How did you keep going?
Well, I as difficult as things were, I always looked for evidence that we were going to be successful, even little pieces of evidence that we were going to be successful. Mostly I was getting evidence that we weren't going to be successful. It's not funny. Nobody's watching. The advertisers don't like it. The cable operators aren't distributing it. But every once in a while, something came along that made it look like it was successful. And the first thing was our first hit show. It was called Mystery Science Theater 3000, which was a show where 3 comedians basically sat watching bad movies and making wisecracks and funny remarks about them while the movie was playing. And interestingly enough, that came in the mail before we launched. It came from some guys who were doing that show in Minneapolis at a very small television station, UHF station. And they sent us a tape, and they sent a letter with it saying, hey, we heard you guys are starting a comedy channel. Is this something you'd be interested in? And of course we went, oh my gosh, this thing is great. And it went on to be a big hit. But the whole idea that an innovative television show like that, which otherwise wouldn't have really seen the light of day, it wasn't going to go on NBC or HBO or anywhere else, suddenly there's a comedy channel in the world, and innovative comedy is going to find us. And that was the idea. So that was one thing that kept me going. And the other is just, the conviction that it's going to work. That whether it's us or somebody else, there is going to be a comedy network in the world. And there was somebody else. We got competition 6 months out.
Yeah, that's what happens when you blaze, isn't it? People are straight away copying. And I think that idea about it will work out in the end is so common to Mavericks, is that belief that, it will work out, just keep going with it. I've got a question for you. A lot of Mavericks inside corporations, socialized Mavericks, struggle because they tend to get hired to do a thing. They do it often much quicker and much more efficiently than expected. So then they get bored, and then they look around and start fixing other people's problems. And then they have problems because most other people don't like that. You might be hired to do ops, and then you see there's a marketing problem and you fix that, and the marketing director is upset. So have you got any advice for people who are inside a business like that with that entrepreneurial mind? What can they do other than leave?
Well,
I left, but I'm sure there's people who probably would rather stay.
Well, let me ask you a question. Were you working in a new business development area, or you were just working in your area?
I was hired in HR, but ended up kind of being almost like the hub, because ended up just working in all the departments, if that makes sense, from a strategic level.
Yeah, good for you. Well, you know what? I have a similar story. When I said I was at CBS, and I was there for a year, and I was doing okay. Everybody seemed to like me, and I was getting, noticed. And I was working on a financial report there, because that's what I did. And I said, this is kind of a dull financial report. Let me see who's using it. So I looked at the distribution list. There were about 25 people on it. And I took it upon myself to go visit those people and say, hey, what do you get out of this report? Can I make it better? And they basically said the same thing, which is nothing. We get it. We look at it for about 1 second, and then we realize it's that report, and we throw it out. And I said, it takes me about 10 or 15 hours a week to do this report. So I walked into my boss's office and I said, nobody's looking at this thing. I'm spending 10 or 15 hours a week on it. What's wrong with that picture? And she said, Art, we've been doing this report this way for the last 7 years. There's absolutely no reason to stop doing it this way now. And I thought, okay, that's my exit line right there. And I left because, this was obviously not a place where someone like me, who was, by my own reckoning, and I say that now, I probably wouldn't have said it then, but, smart, ambitious, and really interested in doing a good job. Let's put it that way. To be told that, we don't care.
You know what? That is so common. I mean, I remember being in an organisation, and I did the same thing, but from the other end, where the HR department was spending hours delivering a report that went to finance. And when I looked at it, I thought, I'm not sure why we're doing this. So I went to finance and said the same thing. What do you do with this? And they said, we file it. I goes, yeah, but before you file it, what do you do? She's like, no. We file it. And it's like, so why are we sending you this every month? We're like, we don't know. We just get it. So then we file it. It's like, all right, that's the last one. I'm not doing it anymore. But it's that kind of like, this is crazy. Why, and that happens all over the world in offices everywhere.
Yeah, well, just to dwell on that for one more second. If you and I, who met about a half an hour ago, have basically the same story to tell, how many people in corporations could tell that story where they didn't leave and said, oh, all right, I'll go back to my desk and continue to work on it. And I'm not blaming them. I'm really blaming the corporation for not sort of paying attention about how to use their resources, mainly their people, much more effectively and efficiently, thereby making more money and being more successful. So that's a big problem. But let me take your original question from a different angle. And I mentioned new business development.
Yeah.
I was in the new business development area at HBO, but basically the new business development area at HBO had been put together with the sole purpose of launching this new channel festival. There hadn't been one previously, and there wasn't one afterwards. So my point is that new business development areas inside corporations often are, they're kind of useless appendages. I don't know how else to say it. They don't really perform any function. The people, and with no disrespect to the people working them, the people who work in them are desperately trying to come up with new ideas, product extensions. Let's do this, line extensions. Let's try this new product, which is, related, or there's a hole in the marketplace, all the things that new business development departments are supposed to do. But then they go to the bosses and the bosses say no. Why? Because it's easier to say no. Because if you say no, you don't have to spend any more money. You don't have to worry about cannibalizing your own product. You don't have to worry about actually doing more work is what it comes down to, and taking a chance. So that's my thought on new business development areas. It's not across the board. Certainly some corporations are much better at new business development. But I've noticed in the last, since I was going to say the last 5 years, but, really writing my book gave me a big insight into the fact that what corporations say they want, and I think they're serious, companies want their employees to think like entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs and come up with new ideas that are going to make things better. But I really think it's important that the corporate executives look at themselves and their ability to accept new ideas, to be open to new ideas, to stop thinking about just protecting the existing business to the detriment of making the business bigger and better.
I think that's such a key point, because there is all this talk. It's a bit like, for years, decades even, you've had the mantra of employees are our important asset. And it has taken a pandemic for managers to go, oh my gosh, people are our important assets. And actually doing something about burnout, well-being, meaningful work, all the stuff that was self-evident decades ago. Right. And it's the same, exactly what you're saying with this, is that now, we have been saying for decades that an entrepreneur is what organizations need. And it's now, after the pandemic or during the pandemic, we're like, where resources are difficult, markets are changing, that they're saying, well, we need to do that. But there's still a reluctance, isn't there, for people to actually live out those roles, because it does require quite a significant change.
That's right.
And there's risk, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, and that's what I find what's interesting, is that the manager becomes less important in a traditional management role, because the manager now has to be more facilitator, more coach, encourage and mentor. And their skills that a lot of corporations have tried hard not to develop.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah, it's really worth everyone's consideration. Just that whole situation that you just described.
Yes. So I'm writing a book to talk about these things, and you've written your book. What was the purpose of your book?
Well, I didn't start out to write a book. I really wanted to just write memoir. I really just wanted to write. I always liked writing. Of course, I didn't do that for a living, although I did write stuff as part of my job, including some, working on some scripts and stuff. But I really wanted to write, and I thought writing memoir would be a good place to start because I could write stories about myself. I love telling stories about myself. So I started doing that, mostly about my childhood. But one day, and I was taking classes at a writing institute. And one day I walked in with a story about something that happened at Comedy Channel, and people said, "Wow, that was great. Why don't you write more stuff like that?" Which I took as a subtle dig at the previous 150,000 words I'd written on my childhood. But anyway, I did start writing more stories about comedy, and after a while, I realized I had a lot of stories to tell about comedy, and not only that, but some of the stories were important in that. It was depicting, as I call it, the greatest adventure in my life, in my business career, about how I started this channel and how difficult it was, and what it led to for me and everything else. So that's why I wrote it, and I worked very hard on it, I have to say, because writing is very hard. But I ended up realizing that writing a memoir about business is very valuable. It's not a history. It's not then this happened, then this happened. It's really about my perspective on it, how I felt, what I was thinking. And that, as it turned out, proved especially interesting and sometimes very funny for people to read, and also useful for people to get an insight into what happens in corporations, or what happens in the television business, or what happens in businesses where creative forces are pitted against business forces. And, you do get to a better place, but it's that dialectic, that dynamic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what do you think is next for you?
Well, next, I think I'm in next right now. I'm still writing.
That's really exciting. That is actually, I'm living it now.
Part of what came out of this book is my real understanding I love writing. And if I never get published again as a book, that would be okay too, because I just enjoy the process. I've had some short stories published and some other memoir stuff published, short memoir pieces, and some satire actually published. So I'm just having a great time doing it. I'm working on a longer piece now. I'm up to about, 100 pages. If it ever gets to 200, I'll let you know. But my hope is it will. And it's basically a mystery.
Oh, that's
but
I'm
sorry.
So I definitely want to read that.
Yeah. People like mysteries, for good reasons too, but that's a different podcast. I am also finding myself talking more and more to students, business students, film students, and television students, and speaking to corporations or conferences, not in any formal way yet, although that, maybe I can make something out of that, because they're very interested in how, as I said, how this gets done, how people innovate inside corporations. Even people investing in companies want to make sure that there's innovative forces within these companies. So that's been fun. And then the third thing, which I've done just recently, April 1st, I started a podcast with a friend of mine named Vinny Favali, who's an industry executive. He started with me at Comedy Channel and went on to be the executive in charge of late night for CBS, working on David Letterman and Howard Stern for the last 25 years. No, well, not 25, 15. Anyway, he's a very, very funny guy. And he came to me and he said, hey, we ought to do a podcast. It's Comedy Central's 30th anniversary.
Wow.
And they don't seem to be making much noise about it. So maybe we should. And we started interviewing people we started working with at Comedy Channel and Comedy Central. And it's been really fun. It's really been really fun. And we originally planned to do 12 episodes. We're almost done with the 12, but we'll probably keep going because it's just so much fun to do.
Excellent. And it'll be good sort of thing to be singing alongside your new book too. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yes. I mean, I really want people to read the book, not just to sell the book, but because I think it's, I think it's a good book.
Tell us again what the title is.
Constant Comedy: How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor.
And by the way, available?
And it's available. Where do you typically buy books, Judith?
Amazon.
Amazon. Amazon internationally has been kind of letting me down. I will say that to your listeners. So if you want my book, you might try something else more local. But that's been disappointing. But yes, get the book. I will say that the podcast is called the Constant Comedy Podcast, and that's on iTunes or wherever else you happen to get your free podcasts. So I urge you to check that out as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for this. This is a great place to stop. But before we do that, is there anything that you wanted to say and I didn't ask you?
Other than noting that everybody's got good ideas in corporations when they're working for any company of any size, and that they should make sure that people hear their good ideas as opposed to sit around and think about them.
Yeah.
I think we got a lot out here.
Brilliant.
Very, very good.
So would you come back if I asked you to come back in a few months or something? Would you come back again?
I would love to do that. Thank you, Judith.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you once again for tuning in to the Maverick Paradox podcast. I hope you have enjoyed listening to my conversation with Art as much as I enjoyed having it. At the Maverick Paradox, we improve your impact and influence by enabling you to effectively strategize, innovate, and execute. To find out more, contact us at judith@maverickparadox.com. Thank you.
Are you interested in Maverick leadership but unsure how to apply it? We can help. Judith Germain has collaborated with David Chislett to produce a 12-part video series on Maverick leadership and how to apply it to your creative thinking skills. This will truly get you thinking and putting into action your ability to innovate and execute, truly changing your outcomes. Check out the show notes for the link or contact us on judith@maverickparadox.com for more information. If you are pathologically curious and would love to find out more about the Maverick Paradox, then please subscribe to this podcast on one of the popular podcast platforms. Alternatively, you could explore our resources on Mavericks at maverickparadox.com or read the Maverick Paradox magazine. We publish frequently each week. If you subscribe, you will get our monthly newsletter. And let's not forget my book, The Maverick Paradox, The Secret Power Behind Successful Leaders. For those that love a good discussion, you could apply to join our exclusive Facebook group. Finally, if you would like to work with us or are interested in the Maverick at work, check out maverickparadox.co.uk.